Szanowni Państwo, witam najbardziej wytrwałych na panelu, ostatnim już w dniu dzisiejszym i ostatnim w pierwszym dniu konferencji. A podkreślam, że ta liczba osób, którą tutaj widzimy, to tylko część osób, które słuchają tego panelu. Witam również wszystkie osoby, które są z nami zdalnie, jako że wciąż pracujemy w formie hybrydowej. Sesja plenarna pod tytułem Rewolucja, w nawiasie, a zatem być może kopernikańska w ekonomii. Dyskusję poprowadzi pan profesor Andrzej Wojtyna z Uniwersytetu Ekonomicznego w Krakowie, a obok niego siedzi trzech panelistów, profesor David Delacroix, Université Catholique de Louvain, professor Claude Dowiedz, University of Strasbourg, and Professor Andreas Irmen, University de Luxembourg. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So if I may start just with a brief idea how I've seen the organization or design, let's say, of this panel discussion. And my intention has been to try to link Professor Dowiedz' lecture that has offered a sort of broad brush and evolutionary perspective on modern economics, and then trying to link it to more specific areas of research as represented by my colleagues here in the panel and just introduced, and to comment to the possible extent how it will be possible to link Copernican sort of scientific revolution to their respective fields of research. Because, of course, one could expect that we could choose other methodological perspective rather than Kuhnian or Thomas Kuhn's theory of scientific revolutions, and for example, to try to frame it in the Lakatosian kind of perspective. But I thought that, well, first of all, Thomas Kuhn wrote his first book even before his famous seminal contribution about Copernicus' revolution. So I thought it was very appropriate to use this perspective. And, well, many economists refer directly to the theory of scientific revolutions. But in this case, well, I will ask to comment in a more, let's say, loose way, or sort of loose Kuhnian perspective, but still trying to keep it as close as possible to also to Copernicus and at least to his spirit. So I thought that it would be good to start with a more general, or again, also sort of broad brush perspective, but also sort of provocative. And I decided to quote the very recent view expressed by The Economist from May 13th, the 13th of this year. And let me quote it, that after the Cold War, America and Europe established an economic order based upon open markets, global trade, and limited state meddling in the economy. And then other things mattered, but economic considerations took precedence. Not anymore. Policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic have come to the conclusion that national security and climate change must now come first. So then let me put the first question to my colleagues, to the panelists. Do you think it is going to be just a short run, transitory change, or rather a kind of tectonic shift, if I may use this term, which will deeply, if not permanently affect or reshape the status of our scientific discipline? Today, one of the professors in the previous panel mentioned that we have different scientific disciplines, and each one develops in a at least slightly different manner. So economics or economic sciences, as sometimes it is called more broadly, may also have some specific features in its development. So at the same time, if you perhaps could try to link it also with Copernican turn. But the question is, to what extent do you find this description given by the economists as a let's say, good, appropriate description of what's going on the very broad scale? Just some preliminary remarks before we move to the second question, which will relate our discussion more to your specific fields of research, okay? Please, who would like, okay, David, yes.
Okay, this one, okay. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this. I think it's a very important and broad question. So I started by wondering whether to address the important challenge raised by global warming, do we really need what you called a tectonic change or a Copernican revolution? And maybe we expect to say yes, of course, because so it's a very important event that is occurring here. It's a very big challenge. The young generation is very anxious about global warming, so we really need to change our way of doing many things and of thinking. So maybe listening to the lecture this morning, so Copernicus removed the Earth from the center of the universe, and maybe we could think in a romantic way, we should remove the individual from the center of the universe and think differently. So then I thought a bit more about what I learned from economics about global warming. And then I'm tempted to say, no, we don't need a Copernican turn. And let me explain why I would say no as a second thought. And then maybe as a third thought, I'd say maybe yes in another way. But okay, so so this global warming phenomenon, how can we understand it with what we have learned in basic economic classes? So I think it has to do with an externality. So let me re-explain for those who have forgotten a bit their econ class. What is an externality? It's when the welfare of someone is directly impacted by the action of someone else. And this impact is direct, so it doesn't go through the market. So if I take my car to go to do some shopping, I will increase global warming, and that may impact maybe someone in India, maybe in 20 years from now. That's a direct impact. Okay, that's an externality. So externalities, they lead to inefficiency, because when I take the decision to take my car, it's rational for me not to care about the Indian guy in 20 years from now. So I will take my car because it's more comfortable. And so I will take my car too often compared to what would be optimal. Okay? That's basic externality theory, and we know that. And then we also know the answer. We also know the policy that should be implemented to address this issue. It's just to tax the activity that generates a negative externality. Very simple. So from theory, we know we need to tax. So we need to tax, for example, carbon emission from all the activities we are doing. And in such a way, we will reach the best solution and solve the problem. So I mean, conceptually, that's easy. So we have all the tools, we understand how it works, and so on. So why is it still difficult? I think it's not because of a conceptual difficulty, it's because of the implementability of these policies. Of course, if you start taxing carbon emission, there will be some losers, some gainers, people will complain. For example, in France, when they wanted to increase the price of gas, everyone living in the countryside who are used to make long distances to work and so on, they started to complain heavily. So there are losers, there will be winners. Maybe the winners are not born yet. And then the question is how to compensate those people. So between countries, it's a game that is complicated, but it's more, so it's more political science, no? The challenge is more on the side of political science, how to design institutions that would implement the policy we know we should implement, no? So in that sense, I do not see any major breakthrough in terms of economics. Then the third thought I had is that maybe still there is something which would require more change of perspective. It has to do with what's the objective? What's our objective? So the usual way, so in economics, is to build, let's call it a social welfare function, which is something which represents the welfare of everyone. So I would, for example, compute the welfare of Michel, of Christophe, of everyone here, and then sum all these welfare. That will be my social welfare. So the welfare of everybody here, the welfare of everybody on Earth, and that's the thing I will try to use as a criterion to design policy. So that's the usual way, but maybe here we will need to move away from this measure of welfare, trying to encompass more like the welfare of the planet, like a planetary welfare or something like that. That would maybe incorporate the welfare of giving some weights to biodiversity, maybe beyond what it brings to us as benefits. Maybe to rethink a bit how to evaluate the welfare of a planet. And that would probably require some drastic change of seeing things, but I don't know in how, so that's an exploratory proposal.
Thank you. So just a short comment. So an interesting point would be also to find, to make compatible the welfare of the panel with the welfare of the audience, if I may comment like this, which is not always the case. But another remark is, because you mentioned that what is not covered by economics, then it is the area of political science. But then still we have also neoclassical political economy, which probably also now can have a bigger say than in the past. So if you also could, now Claude, if you could also refer to this point. Or, sorry, I took the alphabetical order, so, but please, Andreas, please, of course.
Well, okay. Okay, is that right? Yeah, I mean, let me I get back to what you just mentioned. When I read your question, I was reminded of the fact that our discipline in the 19th century was called political economy. So that political activity has to be seen in a in the system that describes society as a whole, and politics, of course, plays an important role. And the questions that are mentioned in the quote from The Economist certainly refers to geopolitics. Well, if you look at the end of the Cold War, there was, of course, the question on the table: how would the new world order look like? And there are important dimensions to this. Of course, there is the economic dimension, and economics came first at this time in particular because there was this huge potential for Eastern European countries in particular. I'm not telling you a secret here, of convergence, right? Because there was the possibility to change the economic system. There was the possibility of making huge investments in infrastructure to attract foreign direct investment. And a lot of domestic investments, and that actually turned out to be quite fruitful. The standard of living in this part of the world has has increased substantially since the end of World War II. But there was also the question of the political equilibrium and the military equilibrium. And we know since last year that the stability of the political or military equilibrium has been shaken substantially. And that was not necessarily to be expected at the end of the Cold War. Let me remind you of Francis Fukuyama, who wrote this famous article and later the book about the end of history. And there was this idea that, oh, well, wonderful, now the capitalist system in different disguises, maybe the social economy as in Germany or the Scandinavian countries, or the more capitalist system in the Anglophone world, that would now succeed and everybody would embrace it, and that would give us a possibility for peace and prosperity in the future. Now, of course, security is the most important element that a successful economy needs, and we've seen that this belief was a wish and it has been shaken drastically since last year. Now, of course, that causes for security, and that was also mentioned in the quote from The Economist, security has become the #1 point on the political agenda, which is pretty unfortunate because we all know what David Delacroix just mentions, that the environmental challenges of our planet are massive. And the problem, of course, here is that this is a so-called public good problem, or what the ecologist Garrett Hardin in 1961 called the tragedy of the commons, right? If I reduce my emissions, then maybe somebody else says, okay, I don't want the disadvantages of this, and let me just add to the emissions of let's say, CO2 or something like this. Now, what can we do about this, or what is the pragmatic approach to this? My personal view is that we probably should try to figure out ways to cope with the negative consequences that are more or less inevitable, negative consequences of environmental degradation. My personal view is that solving this problem is not immediate. That requires probably a lot of invention, a lot of technical change. In this respect, I think economics can also contribute something, because my physics friends, they tell me that a lot of technologies, clean, environmentally friendly technologies, they are actually on the table. But then as an economist, I tell them, so why are they not implemented? And the reason is because most of them, they're not economically viable. Right? So individuals, they don't want to make these investments to implement these technologies that are actually on the table. And here, of course, economic policy can help, let's say, through taxes or subsidies, right, to make the implementation of these technologies economically viable. Now, whether this is easy is probably not the case, right? Whether that's an immediate solution is neither an obvious case, but I think this is the direction to which we are headed, and therefore I think The Economist is quite right with the assessment that security and environmental concerns are now overriding purely economic objectives. Thanks.
Thank you, Andreas. And now, Claude, please, if you could comment on the broad issues. Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much. I will follow up to the presentations of David and Andreas. For David, I agree with one point and I disagree with another one. And I want also to come back to your point about security. I think the biggest deal we have to address in economic theory these days is what is going on is trial and error in trying to model within environmental economics, ecological economics, and even in economics, all the problem of natural resources. Linked to your question about what is going on Earth and what will be the day life in a few decades. In looking at that, I come to the conclusion, more or less, we are probably in our modeling exercises too lazy. We are using what works quite fine, and this is quite good to say, even if the model is wrong, if it helps you to go forward, still use the model. But we should also think inside this box, but also to accept to go outside the box. I just want to give you one example who is quite funny. Before coming, I wrote again the paper in the American Economic Review by Cobb Douglas, 1928, about what should be done more or less, and they fix about capital, about labor. And on page 165, do you know what they introduce? We should also model the third factor, natural resources, etc. And since that time, nothing is going on. So they mentioned this already 100 years ago. More or less, and nothing has been really done since that. And this is probably also linked to your question about the Copernican turn, etc. There is these days also a competition inside the subdisciplines, inside the discipline of what economic theory should do. And probably if in this way of trial and error to go forward of a paradigm change, that means also that really, this is not evolution paradigm change. This is really a heavy change in the way we want to model all this. This is a huge exercise, and this needs also to reconsider more or less of what have been done in economic theory over the last century. So on this point, David, I think there is still a lot of things to do in economic theory, and not only think if what Michel told about the empirical turn will not help us to go forward if we don't have the theoretical framework and build on this theoretical framework. Even the historians are doing this. I mention often Werner Sombart, who wrote famous books in 6 volumes about what is capitalism, etc. In the paper in 1929 in the Economic History Review, he say also no theory, no history. IFA, no theory, no economics. And this is also very true in the evolution of the process. About security, I agree, this is a heavy problem. But if you let me introduce a German word, I think I really hope for the several nations we will not come back to what was defined in the 19th century by the Germans as Nationalökonomie. Because this would also be the wrong way. You should take care of your economy as a Nationalökonomie, but also think in an open world. We are in an evolutionary process. And probably all of us say, it was better 50 years ago, or 20 years ago, etc. But okay, but this will not make the difference. We are preparing the future and building of the history of these several nations to go forward. The point I totally agree with you is the measurement of growth, etc. And there is a big deal since Kuznets and all the others introduced GDP, or an indicator of measure who have been imposed after the NBR created in 1920 by Mitchell, etc. And then national accounting became really famous. We built some indicators, and probably also on the empirical side, we have to rethink several indicators who gives us, in addition to GDP and other measures, other indicators to go forward. And this is again my thesis about think inside the box GDP, but also try to make a risk if you want to make a paradigm change, because our job is to create knowledge. So if you want to create knowledge, you have to take risk, and also to take risk to introduce other indicators. And with trial and error, maybe some indicators will disappear, but this is how it works in science. And at the end, you come to a better level, and not to impose any ideology, you kill this as a Popperian, and you go again to another level, etc. And this makes, in my sense, this really important. As you mentioned also for the status in the field, just a few words about this, I could just say as a journal editor and linked to economic history and cliometrics especially, I have the feeling now over the last 2-3 years, I receive much more submissions who address the environmental question and the climate question and also the finance question. And what is really interesting in Cliometrica, it's probably for others, I see much more interdisciplinary research. That means also that people from the hard science, physics guys works with a historian, or a geography guy works with a biologist. and etc. And this makes also on the frontier of all the disciplines, you can create new knowledge, and this is also quite crazy. I don't not fight for a reunification of all the sciences, but at the end, the way we are doing science is not so really different. The topics we're addressing, the context and the historical context is different, but the way we are opening is really important. And for the younger generation, as you say, this topic about climate change, etc., this should be addressed in several lectures, and this is done by most of us now these days. So these are my few comments about the first question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So you've already related somewhat directly to your own research, but this is well, my second question actually to all the panelists. So the question is whether your respective areas of research gained importance within our, let's say, discipline and outside it since the global financial crisis. It's a, well, sort of watershed, but you may choose your own, let's say, watershed, which is perhaps more important than the global financial crisis. So I assume that your own research has gained importance, and perhaps, as I wrote it, presumably at the expense of areas not represented in the panel. But if so, has it been mainly due to theoretical, methodological, or rather empirical progress? And has this process meant more convergence or more divergence of views within your own sub-discipline? And, well, so if you could then like to comment on the development of your sub-discipline in the longer perspective, and now more directly to Copernican linkages. Have there been any episodes resembling a paradigm shift, and do you see any signs of an upcoming turn in your field, and is there a need for one? You've already responded somewhat to that, but if you could, using your own experience, and I would be also grateful following Professor De Vries' lecture, if you could also try to place your own research in his taxonomies, okay? Because it will be also interesting whether in your own research those proportions, for example, between theory and measurement have also evolved somehow, okay? So who would like to, David, again, please.
Keep the same order. Yes. Okay, so I will say a few words on the global financial crisis and then about my own discipline. So I remember well when so in 2008-9, in fact, many people, I mean, probably the people at the extreme left were very happy because they were saying it's the end of capitalism. It will fall by itself. It will completely collapse. And so they were rejoicing. Finally, we did not see any of that. And I think even at that time, I saw this big crisis again. So it was big because it was unexpected. We suddenly discovered that many loans were in fact with no value. It was really unexpected, so it looked big, but then in the end, seen from today, it's like a business cycle shock. So a shock is by definition unexpected. So that's so it's a big business cycle shock, which again we could understand, I think, with the classical tools. Of course, it led probably in business cycle theory to more developments to improve the financial modeling of things, the financial side, the banking side. So that's good, but I don't see a big change, like to say after that, oh, we will go back to a planned economy, no more markets, no more capitalism. And today, so personally, so I work in growth, theory and data, but over a very long period of time. And so if you look over a very long period of time, so this 2008 crisis, it's just a little a little blip in the series. Maybe after there was a kind of slower recovery than what we could expect. But from my viewpoint, nothing so really big. So personally, I said I work on long-run growth, so over centuries, over maybe even millennia. And I focus on what is called human capital. So human capital is this notion that was popularized by the Nobel Prize winner Gary Becker in the 60s. It's all the personal attributes such as knowledge, skills, that makes people productive and also maybe able to enjoy more things in life. So it has applications in both micro and macro, and I focus more on macro. So these days I'm involved in a data collection project, collecting data on individual professors in Europe, everywhere in Europe, before 1800, so from the first universities to 1800. So for the moment, we have 62,000 scholars in that database, which we intend to use in different analyses to see what were the features of academia that were positive or negative in relation to development of Europe. And so in human capital theories, I think there was kind of a paradigm shift when it was introduced in the 60s. Because before this emphasis on human capital, growth was very much about physical capital, so accumulating factories, building dams, building roads, so increasing productivity in agriculture. So all these things you see in a classical production function, so physical capital, land, productivity. And at that time, labor was seen more like as a cost. Wow, we have all those workers that we have to pay. So it was like a cost. Now with human capital, the workers have a capital embodied in themselves that has a return, and that changes in which they can invest, in which the society can invest. And so that's a true change of perspective. So in the 60s, I would say. So that is maybe important. So now in terms of data, in terms of measurement, there has been huge changes over time. And we can maybe also see a little bit about the future, how it will be. So let me sketch very briefly the different steps. So at some point, when the notion of human capital was introduced, it was important to measure this stock for a country. And so people started to compute the mean length of schooling, for example, over time for a given country, or the mean secondary school enrollment rate, maybe by gender, and so aggregate measures like that. So that was probably the first step. And so for historical data, if we go a long time back in time, the only way we could do that is to have a kind of measure of literacy by looking at marriage registers and counting who is signing the marriage record in the church and who is just putting a cross, which would be an indication of being not literate at all. So averaging those crosses and so on would give a measure of human capital in the past. So in microeconomics, today they have done a lot of stuff because we have extremely good data on individual characteristics and even over life of persons. So there is a huge literature developing now on individual human capital. So what I'm doing in my European project is to collect data on people. So linking actual people, recognizing that the human capital it's those guys. So Copernicus and thousands of other people in Europe. Now, what about the future? And is it going to be a major shift? So what I see now, there is more and more effort put into digitalizing all the books, all the texts written by those guys. For example, my own university in Louvain, they have a big project, first digitalizing and then, how is it called, by OCR techniques, trying to get the text of the writings of Erasmus and the famous people who went through them. And then probably the future will be not just to look at the people, but look at the actual content of what they wrote and how it links people together. Like you could maybe spot an idea coming here, then it will be matched with what is written elsewhere, and then you can, using network theory and then combining with linguistic analysis of those texts, maybe that's the future of the analysis in terms of human capital. So is it going to be a Copernican revolution? New data doesn't imply by itself a Copernican revolution. So I don't know whether it will completely change our view on how knowledge accumulates, become diffused, but so we will see.
Well, we had quite, in my view, optimistic account of the impact of global financial crisis. I would think that given now our uncertainty regarding the course of the future events, namely whether we will face a stagflationary threat or so whether inflation will be a more important threat in the future, or deflation or secular stagflation, and also the impact of distributional problems, accumulation of wealth and polarization of incomes. So I wonder whether because it's another story, I mean your own research project, but I mean those more general this more general framework within which, or context within which we have to place our own research. So I would be happy now to hear whether our two other colleagues will share this optimism also about the future of capitalism, and within their own field of research also. So please. The same. Okay.
Let me start addressing your initial question first, and then hopefully I get back to what you just mentioned. Maybe it's important for the audience to really understand what the theory of economic growth, or growth theory, tries to accomplish. Right here, we really look at long-run trends over centuries or sometimes even millennia, and one of the key regularity that this theory wants to explain is the regularity that is called exponential growth. That means over the last 140 years, let's say since 1870, in many of today's industrialized countries, the level of GDP per capita, which we consider the proxy for the standard of living, has been growing at an almost constant rate, close to 2%. Now that's an average rate. Of course, if you look at the time trend, then you see, for instance, the Great Depression is a decade during which growth was zero or even negative. But that was followed then by a period during which growth accelerated, so that on average, that trend growth rate applies. Now that was the hope during the financial crisis, at least from growth theorists, that this could be also the case following the financial crisis, and to some extent, I think it proved true. So that is one of the reasons why growth theory didn't really benefit in the sense that you suggest from the financial crisis. And it's also fair to say that another reason why pure growth theory had little to say about this is that money doesn't really play a big role in this theory, right? This is a theory that is real in the sense of lacking a monetary sector. However, the branch in economics that benefited, and now I'm coming back to Michel's presentation, is certainly short-run macroeconomics, because the crisis laid open some weaknesses in this branch. For instance, people recognize that the students of macroeconomics in their advanced textbook did hardly learn anything about banking and about financial crisis. I mean, an example for this is that the major textbook for advanced macroeconomics of David Romer, Advanced Macroeconomics, did not include a section on banking and financial markets. That was added after the financial crisis and in response to this. Maybe a second reason is some macroeconomic complacency. People were just happy with the state of macroeconomics. And one of the towering figures of this who pointed this out was actually Robert Lucas in 2003, so 5 years before the financial crisis hit the world, in his presidential address of the American Economic Association. And let me quote, Lucas said, "My thesis in this lecture is that macroeconomics in the original sense has succeeded. Its central problem of depression prevention has been solved for all practical purposes and has, in fact, been solved for many years." Now, it's true that Lucas' observation, looking at the past over the last 50 years, since World War II, that's true, but the look at the future proved certainly wrong. I think it's a little bit awkward in this context that the financial crisis was solved globally, right, through monetary and fiscal policy that essentially followed Keynesian lines. And Robert Lucas in 1979, he had given a famous talk which had the title, "The Death of Keynesian Economics," right? So the point of the matter is that probably both Keynesian ideas and ideas that are more closely associated with Robert Lucas may actually help us in the future to prevent and to manage crisis. So one of the consequences, of course, and now I'm getting back to the question, what area has gained dominance in research and also in the curriculum of economics, short-run macroeconomics has become short-run macroeconomics, and with the emphasis of banking and financial markets, has been pushed forward. Now, of course, having said that, growth theory was not really affected by the financial crisis. The question of whether we need a paradigm shift in this branch, maybe we should discuss it later. In total, however, let me point out at that stage that I'm not too happy with the idea of a paradigm in growth theory or of a Copernican turn. The simple reason is that we should see that the notion of a Copernican turn is a science observation. There was a phenomenon that was roughly time invariant or not expected to change quickly, namely the relationship between the Earth and the Sun. Let's put it in very simple matters. In economics, we are actually shooting at a moving target. The object of analysis that we are aiming changes all the time, right? Of course, there will be insights from history that we can explain, or that we can use to explain and to develop policies. For instance, during the financial crisis, I think everything that was understood by politicians in terms of Keynesian macroeconomics, simple ISLM stuff, was very helpful to alleviate the negative consequences of this. But it's not the case that we are like in the case of Copernicus. We try to explain a given phenomenon. After a while, even after thousands of years, we figure out, oh, it's not getting us very far. So we have to start from scratch, right? And coming up with new assumptions, right? And they help us to better explain and build a better science for the future. That is my notion of a Copernican turn. That's also why I think it's probably not that easy to transfer this notion from the realm of science to the realm of the social science, or from hard science to the social science. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. So my field is economic history, and I develop especially the cliometric part of in doing economic history. I see with a lot of pleasure that as David and Andreas both are doing a lot of historical stuff, and even I would say, David, these days you're doing much more cliometrics than macroeconomics. And this brings me back to the real definition of what economics is. And that's also quite funny. If you go back to the first issue published in 1933 of Econometrica, issue 1, with Ragnar Frisch, Schumpeter, etc., they give you the definition of what economics is. Economics is bringing together theory, statistics, and history. And over the decades, a lot of people forgot this historical part. And so I think it's quite interesting now that history is coming back. Even in new political economy, each discipline, sub-discipline tries to reinvent more or less new words, new topics, but we are always coming back to this general definition of what economics is. So for an economic historian then, history matters as for the others. And the field, as you question, becomes really interesting when the world is going wrong. Because the people ask again, why is this situation now, and what's the history? How could you understand it, explain it in this long process? And if I look back to the evolution of economics over, let's say, since the end of the 19th century, I have always the feeling that there were several jumps in economics closely linked with wars or economic and financial crisis. If you come back to the big debate, Methodenstreit, in the 1860s with Karl Menger and the German historical school, Schmoller and the other thing. The main question was at this time, what is the essence of economic science? Do we have a periodic table like Mendeleev they have in chemistry? I would love to have this. Foundations you can build on, more or less, and you can accept this as true or probably good. The big problem, if you compare this with the other sciences, is the problem is, even if you reject the theory, the ideology will continue, and they say, maybe we should continue. If after Newton you have the Einstein, and probably tomorrow you have another Einstein, all this guy will be seen as very famous with Copernican, etc. But this is the process of evolution of science. They will not come back to all the theory who now are no more valid in the scientific discourse. This is much more complicated in economics, as this is always going forward and backward. And I could give you several examples I have through history. But this with the Methodenstreit, 29 was important, the creation of the several journals, then Econometrica, and later on after World War II, important with the Principle of Economics by Samuelson, who was a main book also to introduce theory and modeling in economics. This changed also the game. And then we came back to the more applied side, and now related to Michel, these days, all the RCTs, randomized, empirical turn, etc. Is this the real evolutionary project? Is this the hidden dream of all economists to do as the sciences with natural experiments, etc.? I still think that natural experiments in economics is a word, en français on dit qui chante plus qu'il ne parle, who sings more than he speaks, more or less, à la Paul Valéry. And so there's also a process who is going on that. But I see this much more as an evolution. And now these days, with also what you mentioned with network analysis, machine learning, etc., in economic history, and what I see was I received in Cliometrica, there are new elements of proof. So the people now, they try to use more or less the historical narrative, the context analysis, a theoretical model, but also to accept metrics in the game, and if possible, to have new elements of proof. And this was a debate in economic history since the beginning. If you are looking at the ancient historians, there was a big deal, I don't know if you know about Finlay, there was also in ancient Rome, is it the market who is the driving force, or is it the status, or something like this? Who makes the difference? And behind all this is always the concept of theory, of metrics, of measuring things. And so I see this in evolution, in trying to be as scientific as possible, try to bring forward, I think this is the big deal, a lot of elements of proof and to be as complex as possible in the evolution of the process. And if we move forward to this, in my field, in economic history, to turn to more a cliometric approach, I'm in the business since 30 years. 30 years ago, that was really a big deal. And I think now, with the digital humanities and other things, people see that you need this narrative, but you need also other tools, not just to use tools or to push forward an ideology, just to have the best possible explanation. And in German words, sometimes I say now we are moving, and this would be a paradigm shift, to bring Verstehen und Erklären zusammen. Verstehen is understanding things, und Erklären is explaining things. And this means Naturwissenschaften und Geisteswissenschaften. That means the humanities and social sciences often try to understand things with the other sciences try to explain several things. You speak about what you can capture and not about other things. And if you bring this together, you can more or less move forward to a unification of the social sciences through history and through science. That would be my more or less also my dream about this. Thank you.
Okay. And because I would like to have a chance to give the chance to the audience, but just the last question, because I'd like again to link it more closely to the Copernican turn. If you could please comment on this distinction, which has not been so far that strongly emphasized, namely between evolution of theoretical but also empirical economics, but at the same time to try to link it to the evolution of the applied economics. Because there was this interesting paper in 1990 by Professor Mankiw, a refresher course in macroeconomics, and he referred directly to Copernicus and Copernican revolution, and he emphasized that even though there was a significant turn or revolution in theory, in astronomy, but at the same time, for many years, the applied, let's say, astronomy, meaning navigation, for example, was based on Ptolemaic system. So could you just briefly comment on whether there have been some discrepancies like this in your field of research? That, for example, there was a sort of, let's say, mini revolution in your field in theory, but still in practical microeconomics, there was still sort of lagging behind, meaning that like for example, in central banking now, that the workhorse models which are still applied and to a large extent quite successfully to guide policy making, but they are not in line with the, let's say, frontier of economics research. Just if there are some examples like this in your field, or some remarks on general state of economics, okay? Applied versus theoretical economics.
So as far as human capital is concerned, so if you accept my view that there was indeed a revolution when the notion of human capital was introduced, in fact, in that case, there was no lag between new theory and policy. Like, for example, in terms of development policy, very quickly there was a very strong emphasis on education policy in the developing world. Like, for example, Africa had a surge in education in the 70s, 80s, so I think it went quite fast. But then your question on the lags, it made me think about something else, which is the fact that maybe that the revolutions we see, they are not out of nothing. So like some ideas were already there maybe much before. So even in the case of Copernicus, so I'm not a specialist of astronomy, but I read there was a Greek astronomer that already had this idea that the Earth was orbiting around the sun. I don't remember the name of the person, but he was from the island of Samos. So probably Copernicus was maybe not aware of that theory, but the idea was there. And for human capital, there is something like this as well. Like I would go to William Petty with 1691, who tried to measure what's the wealth of England. He wanted to show that England was a great country. And then he started to compute the value of land, the value of buildings, the value of physical capital, the value of ships. And then there is a chapter 2, on the value of the people. And there he comes up with an evaluation of the human capital of the people at that time. It's not called human capital, but it's something. So the idea was already there somewhere, huh? But it's pioneering. Yeah, then a word about, you ask about policy dilemmas for the future. I think it rejoins a bit some stuff that was discussed in the previous panel. So I think one big question, so if in terms of human capital, it is, so we have limited resources, should we emphasize basic education or higher education? That's an important question for us and for developing countries, but also for developed countries. And then also, I see many challenges facing universities as institutions, and then my look at the past and at the history of those institutions helped me to maybe identify those challenges. So I don't know if you follow a bit the debate in the US, but now there is a big fight between the woke movement and the anti-woke movement affecting universities very much. And I link this to the role of ideology against science. So it could also be put in other contexts when ideology of all kinds try to determine who we should recruit, what we should teach, and so on. There is also the challenge of centralization. So the original universities are really bottom-up institutions. So a series of people, they say, okay, we will start a university. And I think it was a very important feature, important for their success. And there is, in many countries, there is a more and more centralization of universities and a more state control, which might not be necessarily a good thing as far as research and even teaching is concerned. And then the last, I will finish by that. There is also this trend of corporatization of universities. So universities becoming more and more like private firms, seeing students as clients. That's also, I think, a challenge we face in our institutions.
Thank you.
Yeah, let me first comment on the idea of discrepancy and lags between the progress of theory and applications in the theory of economic growth. I mentioned that the theory of economic growth evolves essentially with and in response to its object of analysis and probably also with methodological progress. It is just often the case that the stylized facts that we want to explain as people interested in economic development appear sometime after the fact, after it has actually happened. Let me just give you an example. The famous Malthusian assumption that Reverend Malthus came up in his famous article in 1998 on the relationship between per capita income and fertility and population growth was that he said, okay, if people get richer, they will have more kids. That was a central element of his theory. Now we know that when he came up with this theory, it was probably correct for thousands of years in the past, but when he came up with it, it ceased to be precise, and something new was starting. But how many years, how many data do you need to figure out that such a law, entre guillemets, does not hold anymore, right? Another example is, of course, Karl Marx. Capitalism was underway. There were tons of firms and production sites were constructed, and then Karl Marx came up with the idea, so maybe we should study the implications of this. Or even in 1911, it was Schumpeter who described for the first time the dynamics of capitalism, even though the system had been going on for more than 100 years. So it's not really a surprise that there are many cases, right, where we first need stylized facts, and they become apparent quite a few years after the fact, after things had actually happened. Now, when it comes to the article of Mankiw you mentioned, maybe one incidence of what he describes with respect to Copernicus is what I tried to mention in my previous statement about how to deal with crises, right? So some people say Keynesian economics is dead because they have a good argument where some of the predictions did not work, right? Nevertheless, the crisis of 2008 could still be managed, and could be managed well, with the tools that Keynesian economics came up with in the 1930s, right? Maybe that's one of the incidents. So therefore, I would say that even if some people call the death of certain ideas, we should not necessarily forget them. The final aspect of your question concerns recommendations for what growth theory should do in the future, or where we should, well, I don't like too much the idea of a paradigm shift, but kind of future directions of research. I think one of the important things is to remind us that the economy serves the people, and it's not the opposite. So when we think about economic growth, we should think about increasing standards of living, which means that the amount of goods and services to which the individuals have access should increase or should become better. If you start with this definition, then it's pretty clear that from the natural environment we derive lots of services, and that should be taken into account. That's a perspective that is usually lost if we emphasize GDP, because GDP is the measure of output, and is not necessarily linked to the amount of goods and services to which the population has access, right? There are measurement issues which are a little bit too complicated to discuss here. But the perspective of bringing people first is a very central message of the so-called Stiglitz report that came up in 2008 when the French president at the time, Nicolas Sarkozy, asked a few famous economists about the relationship between measurement of economic performance and social progress. And many statistical offices in the world now have started to implement, measures of well-being that relate actually economic progress to the well-being of the people. Another element, of course, we mentioned that, is the consequences of climate change. That should certainly be more emphasized in the literature. And finally, let me mention the new technologies with their implications for inequality and labor markets that I think should be emphasized more in the future of growth theory. Thank you.
Yes, I will keep it short to allow the audience to have also a debate, to have questions for us. Just to be a summary in economic history, the main problem since the beginning is the use of theory. I already mentioned this, and the mix between measurement theory, the narrative, etc. Should we introduce it or not? I can explain it much further, but this is the main problem. There are two main shifts in economic history and cliometrics. I see it's first of all when Bob Vogel and Doug North got the Nobel Prize in economic science in 1993. That was also more or less a new quantitative way of doing economic history. And now, since the beginning of the turn of the last 20 years, with the cliometric approach, with past dependency, persistent studies, historical economics, all with cliometrics is doing, there's also a new way of doing economic history and bringing new elements of proof in the debate. Allow me just to 2 points for my colleagues. I think the important point mentioned by Andreas was really in economics, this also a debate for all of us, is this link between facts and stylized facts. This reminds me to Nicolas Kaldor, because Nicolas Kaldor was probably in the growth theories the first to put the stylized facts together, pushed forward later on by Barrault, Salahi-Martin, etc. Because in economic science we have this big problem. If you compare it to physics, etc., we have no real laws, more or less. You mentioned Marx. You could have the Phillips curve or other things. There are empirical laws, more or less, but we have no laws in the physical term. As we did. A point to human capital, I think it's really important with the change you put forward with the Chicago School is also for me is the Sputnik effect. Because the Russians were able to do it. So the Americans decided in their budget, they have less capital or other things than we, they must have something different. And so probably they have human capital. Also to do accumulation, and this trend at the beginning, for me, but this will be a debate with David, the game changer here for me is Schulz, and Bigger came later on, and I have his paper in mind, Investment in Human Capital, volume 6, 51, number 1, page 1 to 17, 1961. You have to go, you can check it, but I think that's the real, just to engage a debate with my colleagues. This is also part of the game, no? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So now if anybody would like to ask, to take the opportunity to have such great panelists here, and I'm sure they will be willing to answer your questions, or if somebody would like to comment on what was... Yes, please, Professor Debray.
Well, I'd like to make a remark listening to the discussion and thinking about the conference, and it's a somewhat iconoclastic remark, which is that I ponder whether we shouldn't be suspicious about the notion of a Copernican turn. Well, the notion is appealing. I used it. But then the question is, what do we understand by a turn? Is it, and in the case of Copernican and I would say the history of astronomy as exposed this morning, it is something which has a characteristic of irreversibility. While the turn that we are discussing have maybe game changer, but they don't have this characteristic. So we fall back on the distinction between social science and astronomy and art or physics, these art sciences. Though in these art sciences, it makes sense to use the Copernican turn sense. But I used it as well. It is appealing. And I use it in my title. It is appealing, but nonetheless, does it really stand up to scrutiny? Because, as Andreas said, growth is history, things are changing. And so there will never, asking the question of an empirical turn about historical issues, well, Copernican turn, we will always say there is no Copernican turn. So it's a sort of foregone conclusion. And so you see there is something subtle here. So the notion is interesting, appealing, but maybe we should be skeptical about using it.
Okay, thank you for this. Would you like to comment, please, on those remarks, please?
Yeah, I think it's a good criterion to say a real Copernican turn should have we will not go back to where we were before. I think for human capital, I think we will not go back. We will not say one day, finally, the knowledge embodied in the people, it doesn't matter so much. It's just a consequence. It's a luxury good. That would be the going back would be to say our universities, they are luxury goods. So students party, we are enjoying life, but it's not really productive. that would be going back. And so it means that the Copernican turn I identified with the importance of human capital is not a real one. But I don't think we will go back, because.
Well, it's true that the meaning of the term is difficult to translate into the social sciences, right? Claude just mentioned, I mean, in economics or in any other social science, we don't have the laws, right? Or something that is eternally true, or at least has the potential of being time invariant or changing only very slowly. Well, there are things in economics that we call law, but that is probably due to the fact that these things were taught by lawyers before they were taught by economists, right? Okay, so maybe you want to say something.
Yeah, this reminds me to the Methodenstreit. The argument by Karl Menger was, if you come back to what is the essence of science, his answer was to say market prices. More or less to have the law to build up on market prices. I don't know if this is what makes the essence of economic science, but anyway, I think Copernic, in my sense, in my wording, and maybe to make you smile a little bit, for me it was a real Jedi, more or less. He more or less, what he did, I would say, he accepted to go away from the dark side and to give light for humanity for the next decades. I think that's wonderful, and this is what we have to do in the progress of science, to give much more light, to give much more proofs, and to accept, to deconstruct our models, but I say we are too lazy, work harder to do it better, adapt it to the context, to the situation, do it better, and always go forward and to give more light to have a progress in the humanity. At the end, that's a positive message for all of you. If you are, these days, sometimes, in other places, I have the feeling we are moving forward like animal spirits, with fear, problem of confidence, follow the leader, stories are not really true or not. In the decision making, I'm coming back to Michel, more or less the causation prompt, the decision making. How can we progress to make all this better? So if you are also Padawans or Jedis or want to become one, I think that's the good way to do in the tradition of Copernic, because it was risky what he did, more or less, to accept to go out from the dark. This means also out from the fear in the animal spirit is here in his context, and to go forward for a next step for the best of all of us. Maybe that's would be my answer to the question. Thank you.
So, well, please, if yes.
Marzena Werysa, Warsaw School of Economics. Thank you very much for very insightful presentations. I think that you covered a lot of interesting topics, and I liked very much the key question about economics, what economic is, which has been asked and answered by Professor Claude Dowiedz. And you mentioned theory, statistics, and history, which has been discussed, in fact, during the panel, because you discussed different approaches to theory and this evolution, different approaches to statistics, you covered metrics, and finally history and topics, the changes of topics, but still it's not a revolution. And in fact, I don't know, maybe I'm mistaken, but I understood from the discussion that you see the evolutionary perspective more than revolutionary. So 2 questions from my side, which haven't been discussed, topics that haven't been discussed yet. One, the value of data. Because I think that what distinguishes our times from the past is the data component. In the past, data was not valued because we didn't have capacity to analyze data, to value data. What do you think about valuing data like the capital, human capital has been valued or is being valued? That's first question. And the second question is about revolution seen from sociological, social component of revolution. I mean relational capital, because what changes, I feel, it's the way that we behave as producers consumers, innovators, because now there is a tendency to do everything in a collaborative manner. Co-create, collaborate, share or co-share, so sharing economy, collaborating, co-creation. Is it a change in the paradigm, according to you, this growing role of relational capital, or more just new bottle for the old wine? Thank you.
Yeah. So concerning your first question concerning data, I'm very supportive of what you said. Growth theory is comparative development analysis. So you need data for this, right? And Claude mentioned, of course, that in the 1930s, we had the development of national accounts, right? That was, of course, important when you looked inside a country. But then you had the famous Penn World Tables that were produced in 1986 that actually tried to figure out whether GDP, as it comes from the NBER in the United States, resembles to what is measured in Nigeria or even countries like Spain or Germany. That is, of course, a very important element of progress, right? In addition, of course, the computing power that we now have, the possibility of data storages, and all the statistical softwares, that is pretty important. The second remark you made, I would also subscribe to this view. I didn't mention it, that one of the elements where I think growth theory should make progress is to introduce or to account for also concepts that were developed in other social sciences, like in sociology, right? Social capital. There is work that was done by sociologists that has made it into the textbooks in economics, right? And increasingly, economists are aware of these facts, and there's a lot of empirical work currently done by economists on the role of cultural mechanisms for economic performance. But I think there should be more. That's right. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for your question. You could imagine that data is really important for me, and archive work is also really important. I try to motivate the younger generation, as I did, and a lot of people did before me. Spend time in archives, spend time in analyzing data, to have a critical view about all these databases, try to improve them, create new databases with your own material, and try to bring it forward. These are also elements of proof who are really, really fantastic. But this needs time. And these days, the work in, I don't want to say we are in a purplish or parish society or something like this. You know this. If you want to have a really innovative work about this, it needs time, a lot of efforts, etc. And this brings probably nothing in the short run. Could bring something in production of knowledge, and maybe not in having a quick career. And this is a big deal. And I think we have also to re-evaluate. This is also a fight I had inside CNRS with the rankings of journals, etc. What I want to evaluate with the researchers, etc., is the production of knowledge, not only to accounting of journals and publication. What's important for me, the publication and journal, etc., in this framework, is just a marketing effect. You did a terrific job, and you published it in a wonderful journal in your field or a general journal, etc. That's the main topic. About the innovators, I totally agree. Would also be my thesis these days. With all the development, there are teams who are doing the work. You are never alone. You have always people who did mentoring you and people who are working around you. And this would be also my message. If I have to give a prize to people, I would give it to a team, because together. But this is, again, my vision of the force. Together you are stronger about a lot of things, and you are doing much better work. And this is probably also an evolutionary process, because now it is possible to build some teams. That was the case in the past, but yes, people are evolving, science is evolving, and the previous panel also mentioned this. Was interesting. A lot of people are doing research, too much probably, I don't know. And that was not absolutely the case 1 or 2 centuries ago. There were really game changers, and people were alone who did a crazy job in trying to bring new hypotheses, new empirical stuff to the literature, and it makes the evolution of the process. But this is good. That shows also that even with all this going on with artificial intelligence, etc., we still need humans and teams to work together to produce new ideas and to produce maybe knowledge and better knowledge for the future. Thank you.
Thank you. And David would like to comment also on data.
Yes, just a word on data. So I think we don't even imagine all the things that will be possible very soon or even occurring now. You were talking about GDP. So initially we were so happy to have these pen world tables. That's one number per year and per country. Then you had the advance of using satellite lights to have the GDP on every cell on the world. And maybe very soon we will have things, for example, using cell phone data. So we have a colleague using cell phone data to track migrants, but then imagine if we have all the data, who called whom, when, and so on. You could also build measures of economic activity at a very detailed level, but that's billions of data. But then to continue with the Star Wars theology that Claude started, the dark side of that, I think, would be to say, so we have so much data, we don't need theory anymore. So we will let's throw away all the theoretical concepts and let's develop algorithm based on artificial intelligence, and those algorithms will tell us what's in those data, what are the mechanisms. So I think that's very dangerous, and one day, I don't know when, but we will go back maybe to have a little bit more of theory in order to guide the exploitation of those data.
Thank you. I think we should be moving to the end of our panel session. Thank you very much, the panelists, the audience. Thank you very much for being today, and we invite, and well, you will invite, I think, also us for tomorrow's sessions. Yes?
That's right,
Thanks.
precisely. Thank you very much, professors. Thank you for the fantastic thing. A round of applause is due. Absolutely.